I'm Aimee Ng, curator at the Frick Collection in New York, and welcome to another episode of Cocktails with a Curator. In this episode, I have the pleasure of talking to you about one of the most beloved paintings at the Frick, and that is Ingres' portrait of Louise de Broglie. It's spelled de Broglie, but it is pronounced de Broglie, better known as the Comtesse d'Absinthe. Although technically when this portrait was painted, it's signed 1845, she was still Viscountess. It wasn't until the year later, 1846, when her father-in-law passed away, that she became the Countess, Comtesse d'Absinthe. She's been referred to as the poster girl of the Frick Collection, and she's certainly been a cover girl. The very first color photograph of her was taken, of this painting was taken, along with a number of other works in the Frick Collection, for a special issue of Life magazine, an early issue in 1937. And although the painter, Ingres, and his subject, Louise de Broglie, are both very French, and in fact, this painting has been referred to as one of the greatest portraits of 19th century France. She was born in Switzerland, and in fact, she was buried there and spent a lot of her life there. So in order to pay some tribute to her Swiss origins and her Swiss roots, I chose for the cocktail today one that is centered around absinthe. And absinthe is a spirit of very, very high alcoholic content that was invented in Switzerland in the middle of the 18th century. It's called the Green Fairy sometimes because of its green color. It contains wormwood, Artemisia absinthium, which is where it gets its name, and it has a green tinge to it because of the green anise and the sweet fennel that are also part of the concoction. Absinthe gained a pretty bad reputation over the course of the 19th century and into the early 20th century. It was thought to cause madness and hallucination. And for these behavioral things, really myths about its ability to change a person's personality, absinthe was banned in a number of countries in the early 20th century. So even in its place of invention in Switzerland, it was banned. And for about 100 years, it was not legal again in Switzerland until 2005. The cocktail today is called a Jaded Countess. It's an ounce of absinthe, half an ounce of vodka, some fresh lemon juice, simple syrup, strained, and topped with champagne. And I have a twist of lemon in there as well. Tomorrow, August 29th, is the birthday of the painter, Ingres. He was born August 29th, 1780. So we toast to him. The painter, Jean-Auguste-Dominique Ingres, was born in the south of France, in Montauban, which is near Toulouse. And he was one of the pupils of Jacques-Louis David, the leader of the neoclassical school from over the late 18th century, early 19th century. And Ingres eventually, too, became one of the leaders of the neoclassical school in France, although he spent a lot of his time also in Italy. He aspired to be a history painter. And this is, for most academic painters, this was the highest status one could be in the genre of paintings. History paintings, these large-scale narrative scenes of historical, biblical, mythological scenes were considered the highest in the hierarchy, with portraiture and other kinds of genre paintings down below. This is his Antiochus and Stratonice, painted in 1840. But like many painters, he had to pay the bills to some degree by painting portraits. And Ingres was an extremely talented portraitist. Here is his fabulous portrait of Napoleon enthroned as Emperor Napoleon I. This is 1806, and this is in the Musée de l'Armée in Paris at the Invalides. And one of his best known, I would say, portraits, among Ingres' best known portraits is Monsieur Bertin here at the Louvre. Really, really quite majestic. And it reminds us that the subject of a portrait doesn't have to be beautiful in order for the painting itself to be beautiful. By the time Louise de Broglie approached Ingres to paint her portrait, he was in his 60s. He's very well established in the field. And he was quite reluctant to take on portrait commissions. He just didn't really want to do them anymore. These sort of, fashionable society portraits. He didn't really want to do them. they took away time from making those wonderful history paintings. They met in Rome. He was there as the director of the Académie de France for some time, based in the Villa Medici in Rome. And she was there traveling. Her husband was a politician, diplomat, and so she lived in a number of cities around Europe. She walked into his studio, and he was painting at the time the Antiochus and Stratonice paintings, his 1840. And she fell in love with the painting and really wanted him to paint her portrait. And some might see similarities in the pose of Stratonice, the female figure at the left of this composition, might see some similarities in pose to what he eventually paints of Louise. So although Ingres is turning down most commissions for portraits at the time, he agrees to do it. He agrees to paint her portrait. Some like to say that it is because of her unbelievable beauty. He just couldn't turn it down. Probably more likely, and the sense that we get from some of his letters, is that there were some patrons whose social status was so high, whose power and authority were so strong that he couldn't turn them down. And she was the daughter of the Duc de Breuil. He couldn't turn this patron down. So he agrees to paint her portrait. The other kind of painting, by the way, that Ingres is very well known for is this group of sort of orientalizing Turkish baths and odalisque scenes. This is his Grande Odalisque at the Louvre, a very well-known painting. And they're about this sort of impossible beauty of these women. They're at once extremely precise, not a brush stroke out of place, not a single flaw across the skin, not a hair out of place, and yet the anatomy is impossible. And just one look at this woman's extremely long back and backside tells us that she probably has a few extra vertebrae than most human beings. And this tension of precision but impossible beauty informs as well some portraits, and especially his portrait of Louise de Breuil, the Comtesse d'Aussonville. When you look closely at it, the precision is something that must be appreciated through details like this or looking up close. And one of my favorite details is the sort of surprising flutter of these blonde eyelashes that are each sort of painted in very carefully, but gives the sense and texture of softness against those pale blue eyes. And he studies these details. He studies her face in several sittings. It's so funny because it's understood that when he proposed to his wife for marriage, he had never actually met her in person, but it was so important that his sitters were there in the flesh, and he studied very carefully their faces and their appearances. So that's an interesting sort of contrast and anecdote in his life. This is a drawing that studies details of her face down to the arc of her nostril. There are probably some 80 drawings that he made in preparation for the Comtesse's portrait. Only under 20 survive today. And in them, they're playing with composition. She's turned to one side, he eventually changes it to the other side, playing with costume, with pose. A lot of thinking and work getting this absolutely right. And yet, the precision is paired with this impossible anatomy. And it takes some people looking at this portrait for the first time to notice that her right arm crossed over her belly, could not possibly have appeared there. Where would her shoulder have been if her arm was so low? And at the same time, that was a studied detail. That wasn't something that was a mistake. Here is a drawing that's actually in the Frick's collection, mostly studying the dress, and in this iteration, she has a shawl on, the way the dress falls, the way the skirt falls, but the arms and that very low, impossible anatomy is part already of the design of the composition. And there is another drawing, many of these drawings at the Musée Ingres in Montauban, his birthplace, again, carefully studying the impossible anatomy of her arms. He's creating something for the composition, and it does not have to be grounded in the reality. And it reminds us, of course, that these portraits are inventions. They are constructed. It is signed 1845 under his name, just on the side of that chair. But the painting is merely an end point of a very, very long process. This is a painting that he paints over the course of 3 years. They meet in 1840 in Rome, and he begins painting her 1842 in Paris, and he carries on in 43, 44, finally finishes in 45. These interruptions are caused by his own other projects for other people, her travel schedule, as well as a whole pregnancy and birth and the newborn months that happen over the course of those 3 years in 1844. 3 years go by from the inception to the final product. She's aged 3 years. She begins age 24. She, at the end of it, is 27. You know, it's so many iterations take place through drawings, and yet the final product and the composition is sort of structured in order to give a sense of ease, an instant. We've interrupted her at a very casual moment where she's just returned from the opera. So there's a yellow shawl just thrown onto the chair next to her. On the mantle behind her, she's dropped her opera glasses, those black small binoculars. Her evening handbag in bright blue is just draped, sort of tossed and draped on the gilt bronze mounted porcelain. The reflection in the mirror allows us to see more of her, sort of that lovely plaited hair, plaited hair behind her with a comb that's just set in as if it's just about to be taken out. Her hair is going to come down for the night. And the detail that goes into conveying the sense of decoration on the porcelain. And I'm just going to draw us in a little bit closer to see the articulation of the lace of her dress. Now, how slender his paintbrush had to be in order to convey every stitch, basically, every line of that lace. And one criticism of Ingres during his life was that he was rather Gothic. And what that meant was, it was a reference to sort of the early Northern Renaissance artists like Jan van Eyck, whose paintings were so very tight and very, very precise. It was a criticism that was given to Ingres, although I don't think that everybody thought that was necessarily a bad thing. I certainly don't. Just another detail of her jewelry, gold bracelet and ring, embedded with just a small bit of turquoise. In France, pierre turque, Turkish stone. It was believed to have some origin in Turkey, obviously. The idea of the East, probably mined or probably taken from Egypt or Persia, now Iran. And just to give you a sense of the wonderful snake-formed ring with the turquoise embedded in the head and the top of the neck. These rings were fashionable, and the fashion was called à la Cléopâtre, as in of Cleopatra. The small joke being, of course, that Cleopatra is killed by the bite of a snake. His painting is so precise that so many of these objects could be identified. And a number of them that had belonged to the Comtesse d'Aussonville were brought together in an exhibition held at the Frick Collection in 1985. This is a photograph of the exhibition and installation around the painting at the exhibition, organized by the Frick's very first chief curator, the late Edgar Munhall. So a number of her objects were brought together, as well as representative objects. So cartes de visite, for example, that were lying on the ledge of the mantle. These were visitor cards that were left by people who visited while she was out. The little corner turned up to show that she was out when the visitor came by. And so a nice collection of these objects brought together to bring the world of Louise Comtesse d'Aussonville to life. And it seems like we have a window into her world, but we don't know that much about her. I mean, we know from the painting that she's very beautiful, she's young, she's wealthy, and she very much likes opera. We know more about her through biographical things like her own writings. And we know that she loved opera. She, in fact, was an artist herself in a certain way. She made a number of drawings inspired by opera. She also played the piano. She had piano lessons with Frédéric Chopin, who, of course, was a Polish émigré who came to Paris and made much of his livelihood giving piano lessons to wealthy young French women like Louise de Broglie. And she was also a prolific writer. She was the granddaughter of an extremely important writer, Madame de Staël, who was exiled under Napoleon and, in fact, spent most of her time in exile in the family chateau in Switzerland. This is Coppet. It's still there. As of a little while ago, one could still take public tours, although it is a private chateau still. And this is the chateau that Madame de Staël held many salons in. It was a cultural fixture in European circles. This chateau is inherited by Louise de Broglie at a certain point in her adult life. Louise publishes a number of books, mostly biographies, for example, of Lord Byron, another one of the Irish revolutionary called Robert Emmet, who was executed for high treason under the British Crown. Just you can see from the title page, if you can read that text, her name doesn't appear on this or any of the books she publishes. She was forced to some degree by her husband to publish anonymously. And in the case of the book of Robert Emmet, one could kind of see why. Her husband was a politician and diplomat, and her writing a book about an Irish revolutionary who was executed for treason probably would not have been good and would have, for him and his circles, and would have attracted some public scrutiny. It's in her personal writings, though, that we get a better sense of who she is in terms of a darkness to her personality. She looks so young and beautiful and fresh in the portrait. She was rather troubled. She always lived under the shadow of her grandmother as this wonderful author, and Louise never really acquired the same kind of status, not even close, as an author that her grandmother did. She was very troubled by and never really got over the death of her sister at age 14. This is something that haunted her. She became preoccupied from a young age and through her life with death, with the decomposition of bodies, with the haunting of her sister. And she thought a lot about her own body and her own mortality. A part of her will later on in her life specifies that she would like to be embalmed if that was possible, but if cremation was more popular then she would prefer to be cremated because she found that to be more seemly and a more poetic treatment of her body. She struggled with her own beauty. One of the most famous quotes that come from Louise's writings and her personal memoir, "I was destined to beguile," she wrote, "to attract, to seduce, and in the final reckoning, to cause suffering in all those who sought their happiness in me." There's a late description of her by a sort of cruel description by a man called Prosper Mérimée, and he describes her about 20 years after this painting is made. She's in her mid-40s by then, and he writes to somebody describing the Comtesse d'Aussonville as quite fat, with hardly any hair left. It's hard to reconcile that late description with what we see in front of us. The same thing happens to Ingres. In his self-portrait, this is at the Musée Condé in Chantilly, he's about 25 years old when he begins this, and he's so dashing and young. There's a late account of him as well, published during his life by Théophile Sylvestre, A History of Living Painters, and it describes Ingres at the age of 75 in again, some pretty cruel terms. He's called a bourgeois little elephant, put together out of misshapen stumps, of an outward vulgarity that contrasts startlingly with the mannered elegance of his works. Again, hard to reconcile those late descriptions with the portraits, and it reminds us that portraits are of one moment, of one part of somebody's life. There's the portrait, and there's the life. In fact, we have a photograph of Ingres at the age of 75, and this juxtaposition with his younger self-portrait really brings to life the sense of paintings having this creative potential, this inventive potential that early photography really did not. And it really drives home the point that life goes on, right? That portraits capture a moment and life goes on. We don't have a later photograph of the Comtesse d'Aussonville. Maybe that's a good thing. And we remember her just as Ingres has captured her. When Ingres completed this painting in 1845, he received a ton of praise. A lot of people loved it. In fact, one naughty commentator said to Louise Dupré, well, Monsieur Ingres must have been in love with you in order to paint you like that. She loved it. In fact, when she wrote her will later on in her life, she died around the age of 64. A few years before that, she wrote her final will. And in a long list of her belongings that were going to be left with various family members, the portrait is the second thing she lists, and it's second only to the chateau itself, the chateau at Coppet. And she leaves this painting to her daughter with the chateau, and she requests that the portrait remain in the chateau in Coppet. That's where she's born, where she ends up being buried, and the portrait by Monsieur Ingres would be there. And it remained there installed in the main dining room until the death of her youngest child, a son, in 1924, at which point it was sold to the Frick collection. But what a lot of people don't realize is, although this is an iconic painting for the Frick collection, and for some people represents the Frick collections and its great qualities in painting, it was not acquired by Henry Clay Frick. And in fact, Henry Clay Frick may never have laid eyes on it. Frick died in 1919. And this, just like many of the paintings, the paintings collection grew about a third after the death of Henry Clay Frick, came into the collection under the leadership of Frick's daughter, Helen Clay Frick. And here's a wonderful sassy photograph of her taken in Belgium. The role that Miss Frick had in the shaping of the Frick collection, as we know it today, is extremely significant, not very well known. The painting of Louise came over to New York City in 1927, at which point the Frick was not yet open as a museum. It was still a private home because Henry Clay Frick's widow and Helen's mother, Adelaide Frick, still resided in the mansion on 1 East 70th Street until 1931. The museum opened to the public after her death in 1935, finally opened to the public. The Ingres portrait of the Comtesse d'Aussonville goes on public view. And this opening of the Frick collection in 1935 is what is being celebrated in the Life magazine issue of 1937. Her portrait chosen as the key work to represent this grand opening of Frick's museum. What couldn't come to New York City in 1927 was a bottle of absinthe. It was banned in the United States in 1912 and did not become legal again until 2007. So with that in mind, I hope you've enjoyed your cocktail. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of Cocktails with the Curator. We'll see you next time.